This is update for March 15, 2025, day 1116 of the war and of the date update. I'm going to do a quick economic overview of the situation in the US. There are major developments, and then I'm going to switch to situation around Ukraine and this whole ceasefire conversation. That's probably the best way to describe it. So first, let's quickly look at the US, what's going on economically. And the reason I focus so much on the US because it's basically linchpin of the world, economic linchpin of the world at the moment. And sort of basically what's going to happen in the US, it will affect the rest of the world because US is providing currency for the rest of the world. So US dollar is effectively de facto is currency for the rest of the world, and therefore all of the actions in the US, fiscal and just general economic, they will affect liquidity or basically quantity of the currency that is the world currency. And that obviously, let's say if you have too much, there is inflation. If you have too little, there is deflation. And so that's why US has such a profound effect on the world and the world economic system in the first place. So with that, let's just look at the available data for inflation in the US. As you can see, inflation is coming down. So it's from 3.3 to 3.1, also coming down on month basis. So both metric year on year, month on month, they are consistently pointing in the same direction. The same is going on for more sort of all-inclusive CPI. As you can see, it's also going down. The difference is that more volatile parts are removed. This is typically energy and food, which is, I totally understand many viewers say it's wrong, and I could not agree more, but this is just in a way, just another way to measure how other parts of the inflation index are working, and I would say that's just another angle at the situation. So as you can see, inflation is going down. It's unclear this is a sustained trend or this is just one blip, so it remains to be seen. Looking at other actions, I would think that this is not exactly sustainable. There are basically options here, and I'm going to discuss them once we move to the next sort of subtopic here in the US. And then I also looked at the Baker Hughes recount, which is essentially proxy for the drilling activity and oil production in the US in the future. And as you can see, it actually went up by 1. It's definitely not a big positive sign, but nevertheless, it could be again fluctuation, but we'll see what happens. But definitely sort of on the plus side, even if it's tiny one. Now let's actually look at the US fiscal situation, which essentially, when I mention about this, about the liquidity, is one way to increase the liquidity or quantity of US dollars in the world is by having deficits, because the all sort of current money system are debt. So the more debt you have, the more money you have. Well, it's not money, that's incorrect word. It's currency. And the best currency is the US. The rest of them are much worse. And so I'm just gonna look. I'm looking right now at these deficits. This is fresh numbers for February. As you can see, it's 300 billion deficit just in 1 month. Nothing really positive here, even though typically should be better time of the year, because I mentioned before that this period till April 15 is when individuals are paying taxes in the US, and it also and US budget essentially relies on individual income taxes. I mentioned this many times before. Corporations don't really contribute in the income taxes to U.S. budget, and the reason for that is very simple, because essentially it's all passed through, and it basically that income is then distributed to individuals, and they eventually pay taxes, which I would say makes a lot of sense. But then let's just actually look at the cumulative since the beginning of the fiscal year 2025, which started on October 1, 2024. So as you can see, just I think it's in 5 months, it's 1.1, and you can say 1.1, you can say 1.2 trillion deficit. So this really means that US is going to hit guaranteed 2 trillion deficit, and probably will exceed it, very likely to exceed it, which is going to be probably record-breaking deficit for this fiscal year 2025. And the US Parliament just approved the extension of what is called continuing resolution there. What this really means is that the spending will remain at the same level. So this is basically what this really, in a simple way, or oversimplifying it, that this deficit is going to continue building up at this fast pace. This also means that this whole DOGE initiative is not quite working, I would say, because a lot of those that waste and allegedly fraud, allegedly abuse that was discovered, it was not codified into this extension of the budget, and so this really means that there's no real desire in the U.S. Parliament to cut this waste. So in some ways, it's almost like this DOGE initiative is tilting the windmills, essentially, because they discover all of the problems, and then the job of the parliament is really to solve those, to address those, and essentially Parliament is looking other way, and that's really the nutshell what's going on. So this really means is that from a fiscal perspective, the number of U.S. dollars in the world is gonna grow. That will provide liquidity, which means that prices are unlikely to go down. But this is just one of the sort of forces that affecting U.S. dollar. So this one is moving U.S. dollar in terms of increasing its quantity, but then devaluing it against the real money, which is gold. The other part is actually kind of more nuanced, and that's really tariffs. So tariffs are definitely going to be inflationary for the US internally, because it's essentially substituting more cheaper things with more expensive things, and the more expensive are the ones that are made in the US, and cheaper ones that are brought from other outside of the US. So that really means that that's going to be inflationary, but for the US. For the rest of the world, it's going to be different picture. What this really means that supply of US dollars outside of the US will be shrinking. And so that's and actually that action by itself is probably gonna lead to another very interesting situation, where effectively these tariffs are forcing the rest of the world, uh, to switch to gold standard, to switch to actually money, to real money, and that's why you're seeing that gold is touching 3,000 US dollars per ounce, per troy ounce. And the more of these tariffs and threats of these tariffs are happening, then the more likely that switch is going to happen. And I mentioned this many times before. The countries like China, Russia, and so on, all of this, they really don't want gold standard. They actually very happy with continuing using US dollar, which is exactly what your Russian president stated multiple times in his interviews, that they really want to use US dollars. And the only reason they will be switched to gold standard is simply sort of path of least resistance, where there is no other currency that has any kind of trust outside of US. So nobody would sort of trust, I would assume, Chinese yuan. Nobody would trust Russian ruble. And really Europe is not able to provide that liquidity. Then there is no other major political and economic power that's able to provide their currency as a currency for the world. And so then what you have remaining is gold, and that would be actually very devastating for the Chinese, and then also potentially Russian economy. I mean, for China, it's going to be devastating in the long run as well, but for Russia, in a short term, it will be devastating. Because what this really means is, if you have gold standard, you cannot run any kind of large governmental deficits. And, for example, growth in China is really significantly boosted by the deficits and devaluation and so on. Similar situation in Russia. So it will be almost impossible to, let's say, engage in a war for Russia, let's say, because Russia is running large deficits to fund the war. And similar, for example, it may preclude China from attacking Taiwan, because its gold is generally like very strong pacifier by itself, and that's why it's not being liked by I would say most governments. But that's really I think the path where things are going. I don't know if it's intentional or unintentional. But the U.S. or current U.S. administration is really pushing world towards gold standard, the way it goes right now. Before I switch to Ukraine, I want to mention a few things that sort of related to Ukraine, but not exactly. I think there are a lot of negative developments are happening just because of the statements by U.S. administration with respect to, let's say, Canada, what's going on with Ukraine in terms of stopping providing intelligence and even the supplies. This really alienated or made some countries to reconsider their decisions to purchase military equipment from the U.S. So I believe that, like Germany actively discussing whether they want to go with F-35 program. I believe Canada is doing similar things, so even maybe canceled it. And I think also Portugal is doing similar things. So I would say this, in the long run, really created a lot of damage. That situation. However, I would say the reason between the conflict between, let's say, developing conflict between Europe essentially, and including even UK, not just continental Europe, and the new US administration, is really ideological differences. And in my view, they are not really reconcilable. And so this separation is probably going to grow ever larger. And the ideological differences really current U.S. administration is trying to destroy administrative state or bureaucracy, which essentially is suffocating or attempting to suffocate U.S. and convert it to essentially what Europe is. Because most of the ideas for the U.S. bureaucracy are basically borrowed from Europe. And that process in Europe much more far advanced, where bureaucracy is really entrenched and essentially suffocating situation, European development. Most noticeably visible, it's in economic development, but it also affects social life and so on, cultural life and cohesion in Europe. So this whole situation is becoming, as I stated, irreconcilable, and so the difference is going to just grow larger. And what happened with Ukraine is that Ukrainian ruling class or political class, which Ukraine president represents, they decided that it's easier or path of least resistance to join European administrative state, and so that really explains significant sort of let's say misunderstanding between Ukrainian president and newer U.S. administration. So they simply, not compatible. So that's why we see this, this visual manifestation of that. Nevertheless, I think that U.S. administration, through brutal force, managed to make basically, how to say, behave. Well, I won't say behave, but follow its directives. So Ukrainian side is essentially following or yielding to pressure. Probably the best way to describe it. It's probably the right choice of the words. Yielding to the pressure from the U.S. And I think one example of that is actually withdrawal of Ukrainian troops, organized and sort of planned withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Kursk region. And there is apparently agreement where there was no active pursuit of Ukrainian troops by Russian troops. So basically it's kind of painting the picture for the media that there is some kind of fighting and squeeze, when in reality it was disengaging troops from both sides, where Ukrainian troops essentially allowed to go back to Ukrainian side, and then Russian troops filled the gap. But on sort of from propaganda media, it's presented as some kind of victory and so on. And obviously, it's a huge loss for Ukrainian president. It goes back to what I stated. This whole idea was completely misguided in the first place. It could have been something, potentially excellent if it were done differently. But the way it was done, it was doomed from the very beginning. And so so that's really what happened. There's no any kind of major fighting or major encirclement. There's nothing. It just basically looks like a deal, and the pressure from the U.S. as a part of the deal that Ukraine needs to leave Russian territory as sort of conditioned for continuing conversation. So in some ways, it looks to me that this is not even was not used as a sort of bargaining chip, but simply you have to leave it just so we can start talking to you, and that was done. This actually reminds exactly the same how what happened at the end of March of 2022 when Russian troops withdrew from northern and northeastern Ukraine. It was also presented at the time that Ukrainian troops managed to overcome Russian resistance and they were sort of beating them up and pursuing them. Well, was not true. You can even watch the videos from the time that I made. It was probably around March 28th, 27th, 29, maybe 30th, somewhere in that ballpark. So that, and at that time, nobody knew that there is some kind of deal. And apparently later, then we found out there was a deal. It was part of the deal. Then the deal then failed. That agreement failed. The Istanbul agreement, that it failed sometime early April, but it was part of that agreement. So this is sort of mirror situation of that with Kursk. And we'll find out sort of more terms of this agreement from a Russian perspective, and generally from anyone's perspective except Ukrainian president perspective. There is need for elections in Ukraine and choosing legitimate parliament and legitimate president, because at this point, at this moment, both Ukrainian president and Ukrainian parliament are not legitimate. So any agreement that they would sign, or peace agreement or ceasefire agreement or anything major, they would be easily challenged and found illegitimate. So that's why there is sort of push from U.S. and from Russia to first have some kind of ceasefire, so there is a chance for elections, because Russia is not very clearly not prepared to sign any agreement with the current president and the current parliament. Because anything needs to be signed by president, but then it needs to be ratified by Ukrainian parliament. Otherwise, it's just it doesn't mean anything. And whoever comes later can always renege on those agreements. The other part, whatever that, and in terms of territorial, it's totally unclear. From Ukrainian perspective. Keeping territorial integrity is the most vital, the most important part of this future agreement. Otherwise, it's essentially turning this whole situation into even more dangerous situation, because Ukraine simply will not be viable as a country if, let's say, these territories are going to be annexed by Russia. Not to mention, there is no support for ceding that territories inside of Ukraine. So whoever's going to get elected is going to unlikely to support this territorial annexation or territorial losses to Russia. And down the road, in 3, 4, or 5 years, nobody knows exactly how many, Russia simply will continue its expansion, and then they will do the sort of final blow to Ukraine. At that time, Ukraine will definitely fall like a house of cards in a very quick fashion, because it will be so population will be demoralized. The situation will be economically disastrous in Ukraine after such outcome of the war, and so people will just simply not resist, and that story about Kyiv in 3 days is going to be very realistic, and I would even say in probably 1 or 2 days. From Russian perspective, and I'm not saying it's right, but I'm just trying to explain how the Russia is thinking is no foreign troops are acceptable in Ukraine, because that was the whole goal. Why, from Russian perspective, why Russia invaded Ukraine is because they were scared that there will be some foreign troops, meaning Western troops. Obviously, I'm not talking about like Chinese troops, but Western troops in Ukraine, and that is posing, based on Russia's statements, it's a threat to their national security and so on. This, I'm totally not agreeing with this perspective, but I'm just explaining the view of the world from Russian perspective. And so at this point, any sort of peacekeeping of troops or anything from the West is simply not acceptable and going to be deal breaker, because it exactly defeats the whole point of this war, of this invasion into Ukraine. And so it's simply unacceptable to Russia. The other part of it is that if you look at the sort of geographically what Russia managed to capture, it did not eliminate immediate threat to Russia, because the Ukrainian territories that are closest to, let's say, Moscow and other key important parts of Russia is really northeastern part of Ukraine, which is Sumy region, Chernihiv region, and so on, Kharkiv. So those are not captured by Russia, and so the whole this, what I'm trying to say, this whole, let's say, annexation of these territories like Crimea and all of this, what's sort of southeastern part, it does not address Russia's alleged sort of problems. So it really means that they did not reach what they wanted in the first place when they started this war, and so they will continue with this war. It just essentially, Russia is exhausted economically and from sanctions and so on, so they need a break. Doesn't mean that they this is just a temporary, I would say, temporary break before the next step happens. And this really, there's also a significant sort of a significant desire to continue the war on both sides. There's a lot of individuals, I guess, in power who continue the war on both sides. So just call it like inertia, or this. There are systems on both sides that sort of exist because of the war, and they obviously want to continue being alive. And so there is that pressure as well. There is essentially there's nothing really that is objectively supportive of the peace between the countries, except one exception is significant exhaustion on both sides. That's really there's continuing will and desire to wage the war on both sides, and so what might happen and what would be perceived or presented as some kind of durable peace is really going to be postponing next sort of step in this drama. In some ways, similar to what happened between World War One and then World War Two. So essentially, one is extension of the World War Two is extension of World War One, except much more brutally. So this is going to be the same, except it's not going to be 20 years. It's probably going to be 3, 4, 5 years, at most 7 years, and this situation will sort of basically will return. At that point, as I stated, Ukraine completely easily will fall into Russia's hands. From Russian perspective, they need all of the Ukraine. They need also Moldova. They need Baltic states, potentially Finland, potentially Poland. Because if you look from the perspective of providing national security for Russia, the key centers are St. Petersburg and Moscow, and the further the border is, the more secure they are. So one of the ways is to push the border in Ukraine, and obviously Baltic and Finland, and potentially Poland if it works out. And that really also jives very well with desire of Russian ruling class to expand, to basically build another Russian empire. As I mentioned before, there are sort of two competing line of thoughts in Russia. One is let's rebuild Russian empire, and the other one, let's rebuild Soviet Union, basically more like a communist empire, because that was really, it was empire. And so the only question is more sort of economic model to push this empire. And the Russian president is cleverly choosing sort of capitalistic or quasi-capitalistic, quasi-free market way to push this whole this ideology, and it worked very well because it's much more powerful than communism, and in some ways, then you can say that you can give credit to the Russian ruling class, and specifically Russian president, that they learned from the failure of the Soviet Union, that that economic model was failure, and that what doomed Soviet Union to failure. And also, actually, on this topic, administrative state, that was really what sort of destroyed Soviet Union. Bureaucracy, what was really the root cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so so then there was desire to, okay, let's switch to quasi-capitalistic model, quasi-free market, and that moves Russia much further, makes it much more resilient. And that's why we see that the sanctions didn't work, especially, and they were completely misguided in the first place. And then that's why Russian economy is so resilient, because it's still trying because Russian president tries to maintain free market mechanism as much as possible wherever they can, and that really builds tremendous resilience in the system. Russia still, but the only true problem is bureaucratic state that's also suffocating Russia the same way as it is suffocating West. In this way, Russia and the West, especially Europe, are essentially twins. There's no meaningful distinguishment in this way, that really bureaucracy controls both countries. I guess I call Europe country. It's not quite country, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say. Now, actually, let's switch to the situation on the battlefield. I'm gonna do it in a clockwise fashion. So this Kursk adventure is over. Everything. Ukrainian troops withdrew. They still control, I think, one or two villages here, right on the border. Russian troops managed to, capture this village Ravka here and on outskirts of Basyvka. So I think eventually this situation will even out, and if this agreement holds, and basically Ukrainian troops completely withdrew and Russian troops withdrew, and so we're going to be back to basics here. Then let's move to the next section, which is north and northeast of Kharkiv. things here are quiet, not much is going on. The next one is North Lugansk front line. Situation here somewhat stable, especially in this sort of southern part of it. There are some advances of Russian troops north of Kupiansk, but they still not sort of tremendously dangerous. They definitely negative. There's no question about it. Then the next part is south. We move south, which is going to be actually north Donbass front line. Situation remains more or less the same. In the northern sector, there are some sporadic Russian attacks, but it's not sort of consistent effort. And surprisingly, Ukrainian troops still holding on to western and southwestern outskirts of Chasiv. So basically, the whole Russian advance so far here bogged down. It's not clear for how long, but for now it has bogged down. Now let's move to central Donbass front line, where situation was the worst, and actually around Pokrovsk situation was stabilized with this new Ukrainian general Drapati without terribly huge amount of reinforcement. Really better use, more efficient use, or proper use of available resources, which goes back to this whole situation that this whole collapses were essentially attributed to incompetence of the senior Ukrainian military command, and obviously intervention of Ukrainian president, who basically forcing this Ukrainian command to make sort of political moves, basically make decisions based on political consideration instead of military considerations. That's probably the best description of it. Where there is still problem and Russian troops slowly advancing is north west of Velyka Novosilka and north of Velyka Novosilka, and we're gonna look into that shortly. So the first situation around Pokrovsk, Ukrainian forces managed to push Russian troops. I mentioned before Udachne Kotline, then in Peshane and Shevchenko, and also Uspenivka. So apparently there was idea of creating basically pincers, moving from Uspenivka and then Peshane towards Novotroitsky and forcing either encircling or forcing Russian troops out of this potential pocket. Did not work out that way. The only result was just really pushing Russian troops from those two villages and basically three villages, and essentially stabilizing front line. That was really the end effect of this. And this is the front line, how it used to be on February 28th, as you can see. So again, as you can see, there are this dent in Uspenivka and then this Peshane and Shevchenko. Then let's move south to this Velyka Novosilka area. So Ukrainian troops lost completely Constantinople, which was sort of done deal. The additional losses over this time really just village Dnipro here, and then Russian troops are sort of moving more closer to Vidradne here, essentially. And also the threat, as you can see, to Bohatyr and Rozliv, it really means that this, particularly Rozliv, is going to be lost fairly soon. So far here, front line wasn't fully stabilized, and I would say it's slow motion retreat, but at the same time it is retreat by Ukrainian forces. And this is how it used to look roughly 2 weeks ago. So really the main sort of advance in this area of Dnipro and a little bit closer to this village Vidradne here. Now let's move to the Zaporizhya front line. The rest of it is here is not much going on. It's frozen. In the final section of the front line along the Dnipro River, things here also at this point frozen, no major Russian activity here. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Till next time. Bye bye.